Perseverance in My Bondage and My Freedom by Frederick Douglass. A project by Wesley Sloan. Hello, my name is Wesley, and today I want to explore how Frederick Douglass teaches us about struggle and perseverance in his autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom. Rather than to summarize the book, instead, I'll focus on how Douglass shows his realities of slavery through his own life and how his determination to keep going mentally, emotionally, and physically becomes a lesson not just about the past, but about what it means to endure hardship in any era. Who was Frederick Douglass? Frederick Douglass was born into slavery in Maryland in 1818. He didn't know the exact date of his birth, and this small detail matters. In his autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, he explains that enslaved children were often kept ignorant of basic facts about themselves. Things like their birthday, their parentage, and even their ages were things that were kept from them. Douglass writes that he had, quote, no exact knowledge of my age, and that he had never seen any record of it. That small fact is a part of a much larger system. Slavery tried to erase individuality. If you don't know when you were born, and if you don't know your own father, and if you can be separated from your mother at any moment, it becomes harder to see yourself as a full person. After being freed from slavery, Douglass later became a famous orator, author, and abolitionist, and a public intellectual. But his book shows us how that public figure began as a child in bondage, in a world that's designed to keep him powerless, and his entire life is shaped by struggle. And what makes his story so powerful is not that how he avoids hardship, but that he finds ways to keep moving through it. To understand Douglass's perseverance, we need to take a step back and look at the world all around him. In the early to mid-19th century, the United States country is divided. The southern states depend heavily on slavery, enslaved people to work on their plantations, farms, and in households. Legally, they are treated as property and not as citizens, and not even fully as human beings. They can be bought, sold, whipped, hired out, or even killed with very little legal consequences for their owners. Douglass describes this relationship clearly when he talks about his masters having, quote, the right of property in the person of a fellow man. The slave, in the eyes of the law, has no legally recognized family, no right to wages, and no claim to their own body. Education for enslaved people is also criminalized. Laws across the South either forbid or strongly discourage teaching enslaved people to read and write. The goal is simple: keep them ignorant so they're easier to control. In the North, slavery is being challenged, but freedom there is uneven and fragile. Some northern states have abolished slavery, and abolitionist movements are growing, but racism is still widespread. Free black people often face segregation, limited job opportunities, and violence. So even if an enslaved person manages to escape, their struggle still doesn't end. Douglass is shaped by all of this. His perseverance happens inside a world where both his body and his mind are constantly under threat from the law, from individual slave owners, and from a culture that sees black people as inferior. Now that we understand the world around Frederick Douglass, we can now begin to talk about one of his first struggles, his own sense of identity. To start, he doesn't even know his own birthday. He's separated from his mother at such a young age and only sees her a few times before she dies. He grows up with rumors about his father possibly being his white master, but nothing is confirmed. He is always being constantly reminded that he is just a slave. In My Bondage and My Freedom, he explains how as a child he began to ask questions about the world around him. He wonders why some people are the slaves and others are the masters. He begins to ask, why am I the slave? At one point, he is described seeing a woman whipped until blood ran, and as a child goes away and cries, trying to make sense of it, He later recalls how he tried to think about God and justice. He heard that God made black and white people in his image, but he couldn't even reconcile that idea with the cruelty he just saw. This is an early form of struggle. Not a physical resistance yet, but a mental resistance. Douglas perseveres by refusing to accept slavery as natural or morally right. He pushes back even when his body cannot. That eternal questioning is the seed of his later fight for freedom. Part 4. Learning as a Resistance, Perseverance Through Education. One of the most important ways Douglas preserves is through learning. When he is sent to Baltimore, his mistress, Mrs. Auld, starts teaching him the alphabet and basic reading. This is unusual. For a moment, her behavior reflects what Douglas later calls the natural kindness in people before slavery corrupts them. But when her husband finds out, everything changes. Mr. Auld tells her that teaching a slave to read will spoil him and make him unmanageable. Douglas listens carefully and realizes something crucial: slaveholders' fear for an educated slave. From that point on, Douglas quietly pursues literacy. He trades bread with poor white boys in Baltimore in exchange for reading lessons. He studies newspapers and discarded books, and copies the letters from shipyard markings and practices writing in secret. He later admits that reading brings both pain and strength. It opens his eyes to the full horrors of slavery, but it also gives him a language to describe what is wrong and to imagine an alternative. He remarks that learning to read gave him, quote, "a view of my wretched condition without the remedy." That is a hard place to be when you see injustice clearly, but you still feel trapped inside of it. His perseverance here is subtle. He keeps learning even when it hurts. He doesn't give up on education just because it makes him more aware of his suffering. Instead, he accepts that awareness is necessary. Literacy for Douglas isn't just a skill. It is a pathway towards eventual freedom and toward becoming the person that he wants to be. Part 5. Breaking and the Rebuilding. The Fight with Mr. Covey. One of the most intense examples of struggle and perseverance in the book happens when Douglas is sent to Edward Covey, a man known for breaking enslaved people. Covey works with Douglas relentlessly. He whips him frequently and pushes him to exhaustion, and uses fear as control. Douglas describes himself at this time almost losing the will to resist. He says he was, quote, "broken in a body, soul, and spirit." That quote is important because it shows us that perseverance isn't always a straight line. Douglas doesn't present himself as invincible. There is a period where he feels defeated. But the turning point comes when Douglas decides he can no longer endure the constant abuse. When Covey tries to whip him again, Douglas fights back. The struggle lasts for hours. Covey is older, but he is mean and experienced. Douglas is, however, younger and stronger, but until this moment, he has never directly resisted in this way. In the end, Douglas holds his ground. Covey doesn't whip him again after that. Douglas later says that this fight rekindled the sense of manhood. His exact reflection is that the resistance revived the feeling that he was not just a slave, but a man. The important thing here is that he didn't, quote, win in a Hollywood sense. Slavery still exists. Covey owns power in the system. What matters is what happens internally. Douglas' perseverance takes form of refusing to not let another person fully break his spirit. Once he stands up to Covey, even if the law still calls him a slave, he no longer accepts the identity inside of himself. Part 6. Perseverance Before and After Freedom. Douglas shows that perseverance isn't a single moment of bravery. It's a long, repeated practice of facing setbacks, fear, and uncertainty, both before and after his freedom. His first escape attempt ends in complete failure. He and several enslaved friends forge passes and plan their route north, only to be betrayed, captured, and threatened with being sold deeper south. He later wrote that being sent, quote, to the far south often meant near total loss of hope, a place where, quote, the slave is a slave for life, and he understood exactly how dangerous that moment was. Yet, even with the fear and disappointment pressing on him, Douglas doesn't give up. He waits, observes, and learns, eventually escaping later on, though he chooses not to share his method in My Bondage and My Freedom, explaining that revealing it might, quote, embarrass the other fugitives who needed similar routes. But Douglas also makes it clear that the struggle does not end the moment freedom begins. In the North, he is legally free, but still deeply vulnerable under the fugitive slave law. He works low-wage jobs on the docks and shipyards, describing the pride of earning his, quote, first free dollar. Yet he continues to face racism, exclusion, and the pressure to remain in a narrow role. Some abolitionists only want him to tell his slave story, but not to think or speak as an intellectual. Later, he begins publishing the North Star, and critics insist that he's not educated enough to run a newspaper. His answer to all of this is the same steady, patient perseverance that guided him before freedom. He keeps studying, keeps speaking, keeps writing, and keeps expanding his voice. For Douglas, perseverance was never a single escape. It was a lifelong refusal to stop growing, learning, and pushing against every limit the world tried to place on him. Part 7. Why Douglas's struggles still matter. So what do we learn from all of this? Well, Douglas's life shows us that struggle and perseverance are not abstract ideas, but they are lived experiences that show up in very specific ways. Throughout Douglas's story, we see a child wondering why he is a slave and refusing to accept that as natural, a boy secretly learning to read after being told education will, quote, spoil him, a young man standing up to a slave breaker and reclaiming his sense of manhood, an escaped slave facing failure, fear, and the risk of being recaptured, but still planning and hoping. And we see a black man building a career as a writer and speaker in a racist society, continuing to push the conversation forward. Douglas reminds us that perseverance does not mean consistent success or constant strength. It can include moments of breaking down, feeling lost, or feeling hopeless, but he also shows that these moments don't have to be the end of the story. His lessons carry into the present. Many people today might not live under slavery, but still face systems that limit them, whether it's racism, poverty, discrimination, or other barriers. Douglas's example suggests that even if we can't control the systems we're born into, we can still control certain responses, the decision to keep learning, to question, to resist in ways that are possible, and to imagine something better. In My Bondage and My Freedom, Frederick Douglass doesn't just tell us what happened to him, he shows us how he thought, how he felt, and how he chose to respond. Throughout his story, we see that perseverance can be quite painful and gradual. It can look like a boy tracing letters on a fence, it can look like a young man standing his ground against his overseer, but it can also look like a writer sitting down, again and again, trying to put out difficult truths into words. Douglas's life reminds us that even in the hardest conditions, people still think, feel, dream, and resist. And the act of continuing, of refusing to let others fully define your worth, is itself a powerful form of struggle and survival. I have been Wesley Sloan, and thank you for listening. All the music in this project was composed and recorded by me, Wesley Sloan, with the exception of ambient song number 20 by Andy Othling, which was used in part 6 of the project.